I should have known something was wrong when Mom spent 45 minutes perfecting her makeup for a flight to Paris, applying foundation like she was preparing for a red carpet event instead of 8 hours in coach seats. "You look beautiful." "Honey," Richard said for the third time that morning, adjusting his expensive watch while Mom fussed with her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "The most beautiful woman in all of New York." Richard had been saying things like that for the 6 months since he'd married my mother, the kind of over-the-top romantic declarations that made me uncomfortable and seemed to make Mom glow from within. At 42, she'd found her second chance at love with a Wall Street investment banker who treated her like a princess and me like an inconvenient reminder of her previous life. "Are you sure we have everything?" Mom asked, checking her purse for the third time. "Passports, boarding passes, Richard's medication? What about my passport?" I asked from the couch, where I'd been sitting with my own suitcase for the past 20 minutes, ready for what was supposed to be our family honeymoon trip to Paris. When Mom had announced 3 months ago that Richard wanted to take us both to Europe, to start building memories as a family, she'd said, I'd been cautiously optimistic. Maybe this trip would help us figure out how to be a family unit instead of Mom plus Richard with me as an awkward third wheel. "Your passport is in my purse." "Sweetheart," Mom said without looking at me, still focused on her reflection. At 17, I should have been excited about my first trip to Europe. I'd been studying French since freshman year, had spent weeks researching museums and cafes and the kinds of places I wanted to see with my own eyes. But something about Mom's behavior this morning felt off. She was too focused on Richard, too concerned with how she looked, too distracted to pay attention to the son who was supposedly part of this family bonding experience. The ride to JFK was quiet, with Mom and Richard holding hands in the front seat, while I sat in the back scrolling through my phone and trying to shake the feeling that I was intruding on their private moment. Richard's driver, because of course he had a driver, navigated through Queens traffic while soft jazz played through the car's premium sound system. "First time in Paris, Jamie?" Richard asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yeah," I said. "Mom promised to show me all the places she went when she was in college." "That was a lifetime ago," Mom laughed, squeezing Richard's hand. "I was practically a child then. Completely different person." Something about the way she said it made my stomach clench. Like the woman who had backpacked through Europe at 20 was someone she'd deliberately left behind. Someone who no longer had anything to do with the polished wife sitting in the front seat. At the airport, Richard handled everything, checking us in, getting our boarding passes, navigating security with the kind of confident efficiency that money and frequent travel provide. Mom clung to his arm through the entire process, looking up at him with the kind of adoration that would have been sweet if it hadn't felt so desperate. "Gate B42, Richard announced as we cleared security. "We have about an hour before boarding." "Perfect," Mom said. "Just enough time for a proper airport breakfast." "Richard, didn't you say there was a good restaurant near our gate?" They walked ahead of me through the terminal, matching their pace perfectly. Richard's hand on the small of Mom's back in a gesture that looked natural and practiced. I followed behind, pulling my suitcase and feeling increasingly like a tag-along rather than part of the family group. The restaurant was one of those upscale airport places that charged $30 for eggs. "Benedict and tried to make you forget you were eating in a terminal?" "Richard ordered champagne to celebrate our first family trip," he said, and Mom giggled like a teenager as he filled her glass. "Isn't this exciting, Jamie?" Mom asked, but her attention was already shifting back to Richard, who was showing her something on his phone. Probably photos from his last trip to Paris, or restaurant reservations, or some other detail of the perfect romantic getaway he'd planned. I picked at my overpriced omelet and watched other families at nearby tables, parents actually talking to their children, kids excited about their vacations, the kind of normal family dynamics that seemed to have vanished from my life the moment Richard appeared. "Mom," I said during a lull in their conversation, "can we go over the itinerary again? I want to make sure I have everything mapped out on my phone." "Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about that," Mom said, waving her hand dismissively. "Richard has everything planned perfectly. All you need to do is enjoy yourself. But I'd like to know what we're doing. I've been looking forward to this trip for months." Richard and Mom exchanged a look across the table, one of those quick, meaningful glances that married couples use to communicate without words. "Actually," Richard said carefully, "there's been a slight change in plans." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "What kind of change?" "Nothing major," Mom said quickly, but she was looking at her champagne glass instead of at me. "Just a small adjustment." "What kind of adjustment?" Another look between them. This time, Richard nodded slightly, like he was giving Mom permission to speak. "Well," Mom said, finally meeting my eyes. "It turns out that the hotel Richard booked only had availability for 2 people. And the restaurant reservations, the tours he'd planned, they're all for a couple." I set down my fork. "So we'll find a different hotel." "It's not that simple, honey. It's Fashion Week in Paris. Everything is booked solid, so we'll get a rollaway bed. Or I can sleep on a couch. I don't care." "Jamie," Richard said in the patient tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news, "your mother and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if you stayed home this time." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Stayed home?" "Just this once," Mom said quickly. "There will be other trips, other opportunities for family vacations. But this particular trip, it's important for Richard and me to have some time alone together, to really bond as a couple. But we're already at the airport. Our flight leaves in 45 minutes. "I know the timing isn't ideal," Richard said, "but I've already called your Aunt Sarah. She's expecting you. And I'll make sure you get home safely." I looked at Mom, waiting for her to jump in, to tell Richard that this was crazy, that she wasn't going to abandon her 17-year-old son at an airport for a romantic getaway. But she was studying her champagne glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Mom," I said quietly, "are you seriously telling me that I'm not going to Paris?" She looked up then, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Guilt, yes, but also determination. Like she'd made a decision that she knew was wrong but was going to stick with anyway. "It's just this one time, baby," she said. "Richard went to so much trouble to plan this trip, and it's important for our marriage that we have this time together." "What about what's important for our family?" "You'll understand when you're older," she said, which was the kind of dismissive response that had become her default whenever I questioned anything about her relationship with Richard. "I understand now," I said, standing up from the table. "I understand that your new husband is more important to you than your son." "That's not true," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When's the last time you and I did something together without Richard? When's the last time you asked how I was doing in school or about college applications or any of the things that matter to me?" "Jamie, you're being dramatic. I'm being honest. And honestly, I can't believe you're choosing him over me." Again, Richard cleared his throat. "Jamie, I understand you're upset, but you're putting your mother in an impossible position." "No. You put her in an impossible position by planning a trip that excluded her son, and then waiting until we were at the airport to tell me about it." "That's not how it happened," Mom said weakly. "Then how did it happen?" "Because 3 months ago you told me we were all going to Paris together as a family. Now you're telling me that was never the plan?" Mom looked at Richard, then back at me, then down at her hands. "The plan changed. When?" "Does it matter when?" Richard asked. "What matters is finding a solution that works for everyone. A solution that works for everyone would be finding a way to include me in the trip I was promised. A solution that works for you is getting rid of me so you can have a romantic vacation." "Jamie, please," Mom said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not making anything hard. You're the one who's abandoning your child at an airport. It's not abandoning— what would you call it?" She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I understood that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a logistical mix-up. This was a choice she'd made, probably weeks ago, about what mattered most to her. "Your aunt is expecting you," she said finally. "She's excited to spend time with you." Aunt Sarah doesn't even live in New York. She's in Boston. Richard arranged for a car to take you to her place. So you've been planning this. You've been planning to ditch me this whole time. We've been trying to figure out the best way to handle a difficult situation, Richard said. The best way to handle it would have been to plan a trip that included the whole family. Or to not promise me something you never intended to deliver. I looked around the restaurant, at the other families preparing for their vacations, and felt like I was watching my life from outside my body. This couldn't be happening. My mother couldn't actually be abandoning me at JFK Airport so she could go to Paris with her husband of 6 months. But she was. Flight 447 to Paris. Now boarding first-class passengers, came the announcement over the terminal speakers. Richard stood up immediately, as if the announcement had released him from an uncomfortable obligation. That's us, he said to Mom. We should head to the gate. Mom stood up too, gathering her purse and carry-on bag with the mechanical movements of someone going through motions they'd rehearsed. Jamie, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I know you're hurt, but I need you to understand that this is important for my happiness. Richard and I, we need this time together. And what about my happiness? You'll have a good time with Sarah. She's planning to take you to Boston College, show you around campus. It could be helpful for your college planning. I don't want to visit Boston College. I want to go to Paris with my mother. I know, baby, I know. But sometimes life doesn't work out the way we plan. Sometimes mothers choose their new husbands over their children, you mean? That's not what this is. Then what is it? She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her struggling with how to explain the inexplicable. It's me trying to build a life with Richard, she said finally. And sometimes that means making hard choices about priorities. There it was. The truth, finally. I wasn't the priority. I was the complication that needed to be managed so she could focus on what really mattered to her. Final boarding call for Flight 447 to Paris. We have to go, Richard said, checking his expensive watch. Mom hugged me then, a brief, awkward embrace that felt more like goodbye than see you later. I love you, she whispered in my ear. I'll call you from Paris. When are you coming back? I asked. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe 3. Richard wants to show me the Riviera. 3 weeks. She was leaving me for 3 weeks so she could play house with a man she'd known for less than a year. Have a good trip, I said, because what else was there to say? I watched them walk away, Richard's arm around Mom's waist, her head leaning against his shoulder. They looked like the perfect couple heading off on a perfect romantic adventure, completely unburdened by the 17-year-old son they'd just abandoned in an airport restaurant. They disappeared into the gate area without looking back. I sat there for another 20 minutes, staring at the remnants of our breakfast and trying to process what had just happened. Around me, life continued normally, families boarding flights, couples saying goodbye, business travelers checking their phones, while my world quietly collapsed. Eventually, a man in a black suit approached my table. Jamie? He said. I'm David, Mr. Henderson's driver. I'm here to take you to Boston. Right, I said, standing up mechanically. Boston. I followed him through the terminal, past the gate where Mom and Richard's flight had departed 30 minutes earlier, past the other families who were actually traveling together, past the life I'd thought I was going to live. As we drove out of the airport and onto the highway toward Boston, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd saved of Paris landmarks, the restaurant reviews I'd bookmarked, the French phrases I'd been practicing, all of it useless now. At 17, I was learning that the people you love most can hurt you in ways you never imagined, that promises made by parents don't always mean what you think they mean, and that sometimes the family you thought you had was just an illusion that could be shattered by a single conversation in an airport restaurant. I was also learning that being abandoned doesn't kill you, even when you think it might. It just changes you, in ways you don't understand yet, but will spend years figuring out. The highway stretched ahead toward Boston, toward Aunt Sarah, who I barely knew, toward a life I hadn't chosen, but was apparently going to have to live. Behind us, JFK Airport grew smaller in the distance, along with any illusions I'd had about what I meant to my mother compared to what Richard Henderson meant to her. The choice had been made, and I hadn't even been consulted. Aunt Sarah lived in a brownstone in Cambridge, the kind of place that screamed academia with its overflowing bookshelves, vintage furniture, and walls covered in artwork from places I'd never heard of. She was Mom's younger sister, a literature professor at Harvard who had never married and, according to Mom, never understood the compromises that relationships require. Now, sitting in her cluttered living room at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, I was starting to think maybe Aunt Sarah was the one who understood relationships better than anyone else in our family. "So let me get this straight," she said, pouring herself a second glass of wine while I nursed a Coke. "Your mother told you 3 months ago that you were all going to Paris together as a family?" "Right. And then at the airport, she informed you that you were staying behind so she could have alone time with Richard?" "Right. And she acted like this was a reasonable solution to some kind of logistical problem? She said the hotel only had room for 2 people and that it was Fashion Week, so nothing else was available." Aunt Sarah snorted. "Fashion Week. Please. Your mother couldn't tell Fashion Week from Fleet Week if her life depended on it." I'd forgotten how direct Aunt Sarah could be. She was the opposite of Mom in almost every way. Where Mom had become polished and diplomatic since marrying Richard, Sarah was blunt and unfiltered. Where Mom wore designer clothes and got weekly manicures, Sarah favored thrift store sweaters and kept her graying hair in a messy bun. Where Mom had spent the past 6 months obsessing over Richard's happiness, Sarah seemed primarily concerned with truth-telling. "The thing is," she continued, settling back into her armchair, "this isn't about hotel rooms or Fashion Week or any of the excuses your mother is probably telling herself right now." "What's it about then?" "It's about the fact that your mother has lost her mind over a man who's been married 3 times and sees you as competition for her attention." I'd suspected this, but hearing it said out loud by an adult was somehow both validating and devastating. She said it was important for their marriage, that they needed time to bond as a couple. They've been married for 6 months, Jamie. If they haven't bonded by now, abandoning her child isn't going to fix whatever's wrong with their relationship. Aunt Sarah had that way of cutting through bullshit that academics develop after years of dealing with students' creative excuses. But she also had a gentleness underneath the directness, a way of making hard truths feel less brutal. "The worst part," I said, "is that I actually believed her when she said we were going as a family. I spent months looking forward to it, planning what I wanted to see, even practicing my French." "Of course you did. Why wouldn't you believe your mother when she made you a promise? Because apparently she makes promises she doesn't intend to keep. Or because she makes promises and then lets Richard talk her out of keeping them." I thought about this. In the 6 months since the wedding, I'd watched Mom gradually change her opinions to match Richard's preferences. She'd stopped listening to the music she liked because Richard preferred classical. She'd changed her hair color because Richard thought blondes were more elegant. She'd even stopped making her famous chocolate chip cookies because Richard was watching his cholesterol. "Do you think she wanted me to come originally?" I asked. "I think your mother wanted a lot of things that she gave up when she decided Richard's approval was more important than her own judgment. But I'm her son." "Yes, you are. And the fact that she chose her husband's comfort over her son's feelings tells you everything you need to know about where you stand in her priorities right now." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was what I needed to hear. Someone finally acknowledging that what had happened at the airport was as messed up as it felt. "The question now," Aunt Sarah continued, "is what you want to do about it." "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you want to spend the next 3 weeks feeling sorry for yourself? Or do you want to use this time to figure out what kind of relationship you actually want with your mother going forward?" I hadn't thought about it as a choice. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the hurt of being abandoned, that I hadn't considered what came next. "What kind of relationship do you have with her?" I asked. Aunt Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I have the relationship with your mother that you have with someone you love but don't trust, she said finally. Someone whose judgment you question but whose happiness you still care about. That sounds exhausting. It is. But it's also honest. And honestly might be the only thing that saves your relationship with her in the long run. That night, I lay in Aunt Sarah's guest room, which was actually a converted study with a day bed and walls lined with books in 3 different languages, and tried to imagine what an honest relationship with Mom would look like. For years, I'd been pretending that her relationship with Richard didn't bother me, that I was happy for her newfound joy, that it was normal for a stepfather to take precedence over a biological son. I'd been so afraid of losing her entirely that I'd been willing to accept being treated like a secondary character in her life. But what if I stopped pretending? What if I started telling her the truth about how her choices affected me, about what I needed from her as a mother, about what I was and wasn't willing to accept? The idea was terrifying and liberating at the same time. My phone buzzed with a text message. Mom, probably calling from some romantic restaurant in Paris. Hi, sweetheart. Just wanted to let you know we made it safely. Paris is beautiful. Hope you're having fun with Sarah. Love you. I stared at the message for a long time. She was texting me like nothing unusual had happened. Like abandoning me at an airport was just a minor scheduling adjustment rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust. I started typing several different responses. Angry ones, hurt ones, sarcastic ones. Finally, I settled on, glad you made it safely. Having an interesting time with Sarah. It was true without being warm, acknowledgement without forgiveness. She responded immediately. Good. Can't wait to hear all about it when we get back. Richard says hi. Richard says hi. Like we were buddies. Like he hadn't orchestrated my exclusion from this trip. I turned off my phone without responding. The next morning, Aunt Sarah made pancakes and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. So, she said, sliding a plate across the small kitchen table. What do you want to do today? I was thinking we could walk around Harvard Square, maybe visit some bookstores, get lunch somewhere decent. You don't have to entertain me, I said. I know you didn't sign up for babysitting duty. First of all, you're 17, not 7. You don't need babysitting. Second, I offered to have you stay because I wanted to spend time with you, not because Richard Henderson strong-armed me into it. He called you? He called me, told me there had been a change of plans and asked if I could help out with the situation. Like you were a problem to be solved rather than a person who'd been hurt. I'd been wondering how quickly they'd arranged my exile to Boston. Apparently, it had been planned enough in advance for Richard to call ahead and coordinate my disposal. What did you tell him? I told him that I'd be happy to have you visit, but that what he and your mother did was inexcusable, and that I hoped they were prepared to deal with the consequences. What consequences? Aunt Sarah sat down across from me with her coffee. The consequence of their son losing trust in them. The consequence of damaging their relationship with you possibly permanently. The consequence of teaching you that their marriage matters more than your feelings. Maybe those aren't consequences to them. Maybe those are acceptable trade-offs. Maybe. But that would make them even worse parents than I thought. We spent the day wandering around Cambridge, visiting the bookstore where Aunt Sarah bought most of her novels, eating lunch at a cafe where she'd apparently been a regular for 15 years, walking through Harvard Yard while she told me stories about her graduate school days. It was the kind of day I'd imagined having in Paris with Mom, exploring somewhere new, learning about places and people, feeling like I was part of someone's life rather than an inconvenience they had to manage. Can I ask you something? I said as we sat on a bench watching college students hurry between classes. Anything. Why didn't you ever get married? Mom always made it sound like you were missing out on something important. Aunt Sarah laughed. Your mother thinks everyone should be married because she can't imagine being complete without a man to validate her choices. I think marriage is great for people who find the right person, but I've never been willing to compromise who I am just to avoid being alone. Is that what Mom's doing? Compromising who she is? What do you think? I thought about the woman who had raised me. Funny, independent, capable of changing her own flat tire and making decisions without consulting anyone else. Then I thought about the woman who had abandoned me at the airport because her husband's comfort mattered more than her son's feelings. I think she's become someone I don't recognize, I said. People change when they're scared, Aunt Sarah said. Your mother is scared of being alone, scared of aging, scared that she'll never find love again if she loses Richard. So she's willing to sacrifice everything else, including her relationship with you, to keep him happy. That's a pretty sad way to live. It is. But it's her choice to live that way. The question is whether you're going to let her choices define your life too. That evening, Aunt Sarah cooked dinner while I sat at her kitchen counter doing the homework I'd brought with me, trying to maintain some normalcy while my family imploded 3,000 miles away. Your mother called me, she said casually, stirring something that smelled like heaven in a cast-iron pot. What did she say? She wanted to make sure you were adjusting well, and to thank me for helping out with the situation. The situation. That's what she called it. Like you were a natural disaster that required emergency management. What did you tell her? I told her that you were doing fine, but that she needed to think seriously about how she was going to repair the damage she'd done to your relationship. What did she say to that? She said you were being dramatic, and that you'd understand when you got older. I set down my pencil. She said I was being dramatic? Those were her exact words. Being abandoned at an airport is dramatic? Apparently, according to your mother, expecting to be included in family trips is an unreasonable demand. I felt anger rising in my chest, the kind of clean, clarifying rage that burns away confusion and leaves behind absolute certainty. You know what? I said, I'm done. Done with what? Done pretending that what she did was okay. Done making excuses for her behavior. Done accepting that Richard's feelings matter more than mine. Good, Aunt Sarah said, not looking up from her cooking. It's about time. I'm serious. When she gets back from Paris, things are going to be different. How different? I thought about this for a moment, trying to put into words the decision that was crystallizing in my mind. I'm not going to pretend anymore that we have a normal mother-son relationship. I'm not going to act grateful for whatever scraps of attention she's willing to give me between romantic dinners and couples activities. And I'm sure as hell not going to pretend that Richard is some kind of father figure who deserves my respect. What are you going to do instead? I'm going to be honest about how I feel, about what I need, about what I'm willing to accept from her going forward. And if she doesn't like your honesty, then I guess we'll find out what kind of mother she really is. Aunt Sarah finally looked up from her cooking, and I saw approval in her eyes. You know, she said, you might be the first person in our family to figure out that love doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment people are willing to give you. What does it mean? It means expecting the people who claim to love you to act like it, even when it's inconvenient for them. That night, I got another text from Mom. Having the most amazing time. Richard took me to the Eiffel Tower for sunset. So romantic. How was your day with Sarah? Instead of my usual polite response, I wrote back, my day was fine. Aunt Sarah is helping me understand some things about family relationships. She responded immediately. That's wonderful. Sarah always was the wise one in the family. She had no idea what I was actually talking about. No sense that anything had fundamentally changed. She was still treating this like a minor inconvenience rather than a betrayal that had altered our relationship permanently. But something had changed. Even if she didn't realize it yet, I'd stopped being willing to pretend that abandoning me at an airport was acceptable behavior from someone who claimed to love me. I'd stopped being willing to accept being treated like a burden in my own family, and I'd started to understand that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who think they can get away with it because they assume you'll forgive them, no matter what they do. 2 weeks to go before she came, home from her romantic getaway. 2 weeks to prepare for the conversation that would either repair our relationship or end it entirely. Either way, I was done being the child who made himself small and grateful for whatever love was left over after she'd given Richard everything he wanted. It was time to find out what unconditional love actually looked like, and whether my mother was capable of offering it. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in our living room in Manhattan when I heard Mom's key in the front door, followed by the sound of expensive luggage wheels rolling across hardwood floors, and Richard's voice saying something about jet lag and unpacking. I'd been back from Boston for 4 days, using the time to prepare for this conversation the way other people prepare for job interviews or final exams. Aunt Sarah had driven me back to the city, helped me organize my thoughts, and reminded me at least 6 times that I deserved to be treated with respect by my own mother. The hardest part, she told me as we sat in traffic on I-95, is going to be not backing down when she tries to make you feel guilty for having expectations. What if she doesn't care? What if she just chooses Richard over me again? Then you'll know where you stand, and you can make decisions based on reality instead of hope. Now, listening to Mom and Richard's cheerful chatter as they brought their luggage upstairs, I felt my carefully planned talking points dissolve into nervous energy. "Jamie?" Mom called from the hallway. "Sweetheart, we're home." "In here," I called back, staying seated on the couch. They appeared in the living room doorway a few minutes later, both glowing with the kind of tans that come from expensive resort vacations. Mom looked radiant in that post-vacation way, relaxed and happy and younger somehow. Richard looked pleased with himself, like a man who'd successfully managed a complicated logistical operation. "There's my boy," Mom said, crossing the room to hug me. "I missed you so much." The hug felt strange, warm and familiar, but also somehow hollow, like she was going through the motions of maternal affection without really feeling it. "How was Paris?" I asked, not returning the enthusiasm in her voice. "Oh, sweetheart, it was magical. Absolutely magical." Richard planned the most incredible itinerary. The restaurants, the museums, that little hotel in the Marais with the most beautiful courtyard. "The Marais," I said. "That's the neighborhood I wanted to see." "Is it?" "Oh, you would have loved it. So charming, so authentic." "But don't worry, we'll go back someday, all 3 of us." "Will we?" Something in my tone must have registered because Mom's smile faltered slightly. "Of course we will. This trip was well, it was special because it was Richard's and my first real vacation as a married couple. Mom, can we talk? Alone?" Richard, who had been examining the mail I'd stacked on the side table, looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment. "I should probably unpack anyway," he said diplomatically. "Let you 2 catch up." After he left, Mom settled into the armchair across from me, still wearing that slightly cautious version of her vacation smile. "So," she said brightly, "tell me all about your time with Sarah. Did you 2 have fun?" "We need to talk about what happened at the airport." Her smile faded completely. "Jamie, I thought we'd move past that." I explained about the hotel situation, the last-minute changes. "There was no hotel situation." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there was no problem with room availability, no logistical crisis that forced you to choose between taking me or Richard. You planned from the beginning to go without me." Mom's hands fluttered to her necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed since marrying Richard. "That's not true. The situation was complicated. Richard called Aunt Sarah a week before our trip to arrange for me to stay with her. A week before. That's not a last-minute change, Mom. That's premeditation." The color drained from Mom's face. "Sarah told you that?" "Sarah told me a lot of things, including the fact that when she asked you about repairing the damage you'd done to our relationship, you called me dramatic. I didn't mean it that way." "How did you mean it?" Mom stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street like she might find better answers there than in this conversation. "Jamie, I know you're hurt, but you have to understand that adult relationships are complicated. When Richard planned this trip, he was thinking about what we needed as a couple, and I wasn't part of what you needed. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you and I spent time together without Richard? When was the last time you asked me about school, or college applications, or anything that mattered to me? I ask about those things all the time. When?" She turned back to face me, and I could see her trying to remember recent conversations that would prove her point. "We talked about Didn't we discuss your SAT scores? That was 4 months ago. And we talked about them for maybe 5 minutes before Richard came home and wanted to tell us about his day. Well, what about when we went shopping for school clothes? Richard picked out most of those clothes. You spent the whole time asking what he would think of different outfits instead of caring what I liked. Mom sat back down, and for the first time since she'd come home, she looked like the conversation was actually registering. Jamie, I know things have changed since Richard and I got married, but that doesn't mean I love you any less. Love isn't just a feeling, Mom. It's actions. It's choices. It's showing up when it matters. I do show up. Do you? Because when Richard wanted to plan a romantic trip to Paris, you showed up for that. When Richard wanted me out of the way so you could focus on his needs, you showed up for that too. But when I needed my mother to keep her promise about a family vacation, where were you? I was trying to balance everyone's needs. No, you were prioritizing Richard's needs over mine. There's a difference. Mom was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with how to respond to accusations that were clearly true, but that she didn't want to acknowledge. Marriage requires compromise. Jamie, it requires putting your spouse's needs first sometimes. Sometimes, yes, but not all the time. And not when it means abandoning your child. I didn't abandon you. You were safe with Sarah. You left me at an airport, Mom. You looked me in the eye and told me I was staying behind while you flew to Paris with your husband. How is that not abandonment? Because I knew you'd be taken care of. By someone else. Someone who isn't responsible for taking care of me. Sarah was happy to have you. That's not the point. The point is that you chose Richard's comfort over your son's feelings. And you did it without even discussing it with me first. Mom's eyes filled with tears. But I'd learned from Aunt Sarah not to let emotional manipulation derail important conversations. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry you felt abandoned. That was never my intention. What was your intention? My intention was to give Richard and me the time we needed to strengthen our marriage. And how did that work out? What do you mean? I mean, did abandoning your son at an airport make your marriage stronger? Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box on the side table. We had a wonderful time. That's not what I asked. I asked if it made your marriage stronger. She was quiet. Because from where I'm sitting, I continued, it looks like you sacrificed your relationship with your son for 3 weeks of vacation photos and romantic dinners. Was that trade worth it? You're not being fair. I'm being honest. For the first time in months, I'm telling you exactly how your choices have affected me instead of pretending everything is fine. I don't like it when you talk to me like this. I don't like it when you abandon me at airports. But here we are. Richard appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by the sound of raised voices. Everything okay in here? He asked with forced casualness. We're having a conversation, I said without looking at him. Jamie's upset about the Paris situation, Mom said. Like I was a child having a tantrum, rather than a 17-year-old stating legitimate grievances. I understand that, Richard said carefully. And I want you to know that it was never about not wanting you there. It was about timing and logistics. Richard, I said, finally turning to look at him, I need you to understand something. I don't believe your explanations. I don't appreciate your manipulations. And I don't consider you a parental figure who gets to have opinions about my relationship with my mother. Jamie, Mom said sharply. He orchestrated my exclusion from this trip, Mom. He called Aunt Sarah a week in advance to arrange my disposal like I was a piece of luggage that wouldn't fit in the overhead compartment. And now he wants to stand there and pretend it was about logistics? Richard's face flushed red. I was trying to find a solution that worked for everyone. No, you were trying to find a solution that worked for you. And you convinced my mother to abandon her child so you could have her undivided attention for 3 weeks. That's not how it happened. Then how did it happen? Because I'd love to hear your version of events. Richard looked at Mom, probably hoping she'd jump in to defend him, but she was staring at her hands. Your mother and I felt that this particular trip would be better suited for just the two of us, he said finally. And when did you decide that? I don't remember exactly. You don't remember when you decided to exclude your stepson from a family vacation? It wasn't about excluding you. It was exactly about excluding me. And you know what the really messed up part is? You could have just planned a couples trip from the beginning. You could have been honest about wanting time alone together. But instead, you let my mother promise me something you never intended to deliver. And then you made her be the one to tell me I wasn't wanted. Jamie, that's enough, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it enough, Mom? Because I'm just getting started. I turned back to Richard, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. You've been married to my mother for 6 months, I said. In that time, how many family activities have you planned that actually included me? We do things together all the time. Like what? We have dinner together several times a week. Dinners where you and Mom talk about your work, your friends, your plans. And I sit there eating my food in silence because any attempt I make to contribute to the conversation gets ignored or dismissed. That's not true. Last week at dinner, I tried to tell you both about getting accepted to the National Honor Society. You interrupted me to tell Mom about some client meeting you'd had. When I tried to bring it up again later, you'd already moved on to planning your weekend in the Hamptons. Mom looked up sharply. You got accepted to NHS? When? 2 weeks ago. While you were in Paris taking pictures of yourself at the Eiffel Tower. Why didn't you tell me? I tried to tell you. At dinner last week, and again the night before you left for your trip. But you were too busy discussing restaurant reservations and packing lists to listen? Mom's face crumpled. Jamie, I'm so proud of you. NHS is a huge honor. Yeah, it is. And I had nobody to share it with because my mother was too distracted by her new husband to notice that her son had achieved something important. You notice what Richard wants for dinner. You notice when Richard needs his shirts picked up from the dry cleaner. You notice when Richard wants to plan a romantic vacation. But you don't notice when your son needs his mother to pay attention to his life. The room fell silent except for the sound of Mom crying quietly into her tissue. This is what I'm talking about, I said gently. For 6 months, I've watched you reorganize your entire life around making Richard happy. And every time I've tried to tell you how that affected me, you've dismissed my concerns as jealousy or immaturity. I never said you were immature. You said I was being dramatic. You said I'd understand when I got older. You said marriage required sacrifices that I couldn't comprehend. Every response was about invalidating my feelings instead of actually listening to them. Richard cleared his throat. Maybe I should give you two some privacy to work this out. No, I said. You should stay, because this affects you too. How does it affect me? Because you're married to my mother, which means you're part of this family whether I like it or not. And if you want this family to work, you need to understand that I'm not going to disappear just because my presence is inconvenient for you. I never said I wanted you to disappear. You didn't have to say it. You showed it when you planned a trip that excluded me, when you orchestrated my abandonment at the airport, when you convinced my mother that your comfort mattered more than her son's feelings. I was trying to give your mother something special, at my expense. Not everything has to be about you. Jamie! The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mom looked back and forth between us, probably realizing that this was the moment when she'd have to choose a side. You're right, I said to Richard. Not everything has to be about me, but some things should be about me. When my mother promises me a family vacation, that should be about me. When I achieve something important at school, that should be about me. When I need my mother's attention and support, that should be about me. You're 17 years old. You don't need constant attention and support. I need normal amounts of attention and support. I need to feel like I matter to my mother as much as her new husband does. I need to be treated like a member of this family instead of a burden that needs to be managed around your preferences. Mom stood up suddenly. Stop, she said, her voice louder than I'd heard it in months. Just stop. Richard and I both looked at her. Jamie, you're right, she said, tears streaming down her face. You're absolutely right about everything. I have been putting Richard's needs ahead of yours. I have been treating you like an inconvenience instead of my son. And abandoning you at that airport was the worst thing I've ever done as a mother. I felt a surge of hope mixed with vindication. But she continued, and my heart sank. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be a good wife to Richard and a good mother to you at the same time. You start by making me a priority sometimes, I said. You start by including me in family decisions. You start by listening when I talk instead of just waiting for your turn to speak. And what about Richard? I looked at her new husband, this man who had somehow convinced my mother that loving him required abandoning her son. Richard can learn to share your attention, I said. Or he can find someone else to marry who doesn't come with children. Jamie, Richard said, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's not fair. Neither is abandoning a teenager at an airport so you can have a romantic vacation. I think we all need to take a step back here, Mom said weakly. No, Mom. We need to move forward. We need to decide what kind of family we're going to be, and whether that family includes me in a meaningful way or just when it's convenient. She looked at Richard, then at me, then back at Richard. I need time to think, she said finally. Take all the time you need, I said, standing up from the couch. But while you're thinking, remember that I'm your son. I was here first. I'll be here after Richard. And I deserve better than being treated like a burden who can be abandoned whenever your husband wants your undivided attention. I walked toward my room, then turned back. And Mom, if you decide that being Richard's wife is more important than being my mother, just tell me. Don't pretend we have a relationship that we don't have. Don't make promises you don't intend to keep. Just be honest about what I mean to you. I left them standing in the living room, probably processing the first completely honest conversation we'd had since Richard entered our lives. For the first time in months, I told the truth about how I felt and what I needed. Now I had to wait and see if my mother was capable of the same kind of honesty. The next few days would tell me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her priorities and what kind of future we might have together, if any. 6 months later, I was sitting in Aunt Sarah's living room in Cambridge, surrounded by college brochures and acceptance letters, trying to decide between Harvard, Yale, and Northwestern while she graded papers at her desk nearby. It had been the strangest 6 months of my life, not because of any dramatic confrontations or family explosions, but because of how quietly everything had shifted after that conversation in our living room. The morning after I'd confronted Mom and Richard, I'd woken up to find a handwritten note slipped under my bedroom door. Jamie, I've been thinking about everything you said, and you're right. I need to figure out how to be your mother again. Can we have breakfast together this morning? Just us. Mom. It was the first time in over a year that she'd suggested we spend time together without Richard. And I'd been cautiously hopeful as we sat across from each other at the diner down the street, ordering pancakes and trying to figure out how to have a conversation that wasn't about logistics or Richard's schedule. I want to start over, she'd said over coffee. That was too strong, and pancakes that were too sweet. I want to learn how to be your mother and Richard's wife without sacrificing one for the other. How? I don't know yet, but I think the first step is spending time with you that has nothing to do with Richard or his preferences or what works for our marriage. It had been a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, Mom had made deliberate efforts to carve out space for our relationship. Wednesday dinners, just the two of us. Saturday morning coffee runs where we'd talk about school and college plans and my goals for the future. Conversations that happened without Richard's input or approval. It wasn't perfect. She still deferred to Richard on major decisions, still organized her life around his preferences, still sometimes chose his comfort over my needs. But she was trying, and more importantly, she was listening when I pointed out the moments when she slipped back into old patterns. You're doing it again? I'd say when she'd interrupt my story about school to answer a text from Richard. You're right, she'd reply, putting the phone away. Tell me more about the history project. Small corrections, but they added up to something that felt like progress. Richard, on the other hand, had never quite recovered from our confrontation. He was polite, but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamic where he couldn't automatically assume his preferences would take precedence. The easy dominance he'd established in our household had been challenged, and he didn't seem to know how to adjust. "He's pouting," Aunt Sarah had observed during one of my regular phone calls to Boston. "Men like Richard don't handle it well when their authority is questioned by people they consider beneath them. Do you think he'll get over it?" "I think he'll either adjust to sharing your mother's attention, or he'll find excuses to avoid spending time around you. Either way, that's his choice to make." Richard had chosen avoidance. Family dinners became tense affairs where he was physically present but emotionally absent. Vacation plans suddenly required adult time that excluded me. Even casual conversations in the living room would stop when I entered the room. It was like living with a polite stranger who resented my existence but was too well-mannered to say so directly. The breaking point had come in March, during spring break, when Mom suggested we all take a long weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard. "The three of us," she'd said carefully, "as a family." Richard's response had been immediate and telling. "Honey, wouldn't you prefer if we went somewhere more sophisticated? Just the two of us?" "I'd prefer if we did something together as a family for once," Mom had replied. And I'd seen something in her eyes that looked like the woman who'd raised me for 16 years before Richard appeared. But Martha's Vineyard in March is hardly romantic. And frankly, I'm not sure why we need to include Jamie in every plan we make. That's when Mom had looked at him with an expression I hadn't seen since the airport. "Confrontation, because Jamie is my son," she'd said quietly. "And if you can't understand why that matters to me, then maybe we need to talk about what kind of marriage we actually have." They'd had that conversation behind closed doors, but I'd heard enough raised voices to know it hadn't gone well. The next morning, Richard had informed us he'd be spending 2 weeks at his house in the Hamptons to think about some things. He'd been there ever since. "Are you worried about them?" Aunt Sarah asked, looking up from the paper she was grading. I'd been telling her about my college decision process, but somehow the conversation had drifted back to Mom and Richard's ongoing separation. "Honestly, no," I said. "I think Mom is figuring out who she actually wants to be, and Richard is figuring out whether he wants to be married to that person. And what if he decides he doesn't? Then Mom will have to choose between staying married to someone who can't accept that she has a son or being single and rebuilding her relationship with me. That's a big choice. It is. But it's hers to make." Aunt Sarah set down her red pen and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, 6 months ago you were devastated by the idea that your mother might choose Richard over you. 6 months ago I thought I needed her to choose me in order to be okay. And now? Now I know I'm going to be okay either way. If she wants to be my mother, she'll figure out how to do that. If she doesn't, I'll build my life with the people who actually want me in it." It was true. The past 6 months had taught me that I could survive without my mother's approval, that I could build meaningful relationships with people who valued me, that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on whether or not my family of origin functioned properly. Living with Aunt Sarah for 2 weeks had shown me what it felt like to be around an adult who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. Wednesday dinners with Mom had reminded me what it felt like to have her undivided attention. But most importantly, I'd learned that I could be happy and successful and loved even if some relationships in my life didn't work out the way I'd hoped. "Speaking of people who want you in their lives," Aunt Sarah said, "have you decided which college acceptance you're going to accept?" I looked down at the letters spread across her coffee table. Harvard, where Aunt Sarah taught, and where I'd be close to the family member who'd shown me the most consistent support. Yale, with its incredible English program and proximity to New York. Northwestern, far enough from home to feel like a fresh start but close enough to visit if I wanted to. "I think I'm going to choose Harvard," I said. "Because of me? Partly, but mostly because I like the idea of being somewhere I already have family who wants me around." "I do want you around, but I also want you to choose the place that's best for your future, not the place that feels safest. What if the place that feels safest is also the place that's best for my future?" Aunt Sarah smiled. "Then I guess you'll be stuck with me for 4 more years." My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Can we talk tonight?" Something important I need to discuss with you. Mom wants to talk, I told Aunt Sarah. Something important. Divorce papers? Maybe. Or maybe Richard decided he's ready to share her attention after all. What are you hoping for? I thought about this for a moment. 6 months ago, I would have said I was hoping for Richard to disappear so Mom and I could go back to the relationship we'd had before he arrived. But that relationship had been flawed too, built on my willingness to accept whatever attention she was willing to give me, to make myself small and undemanding so she wouldn't feel burdened by my needs. I'm hoping she's learned how to be my mother without needing a man to validate her worth, I said finally. And if she hasn't learned that yet, I'm hoping she'll keep working on it. And if she chooses Richard, then I'll know I made the right decision about college. That evening, I called Mom from Aunt Sarah's kitchen while she made tea and pretended not to be listening to my side of the conversation. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom said, and I could hear something different in her voice, calmer, more settled than she'd sounded in months. "Hi, Mom. What did you want to talk about?" "Richard and I are getting divorced." The words hit me with a mixture of relief and sadness that I hadn't expected. "Are you okay?" "I'm sad," she said honestly. "Sad that it didn't work out. Sad that I hurt you trying to make it work. Sad that I lost myself trying to be the wife he wanted me to be." "What happened?" We had a long conversation about what we each wanted from this marriage, and it became clear that he wanted a wife who would put his needs first always, and I wanted a husband who could understand that I have a son who also deserves my attention and care. And those things aren't compatible. Not with Richard, no. He kept saying that once you left for college, things would be easier, but I realized I didn't want things to be easier. I wanted them to be honest. What does that mean? It means I want to be the kind of mother who shows up for her son even when it's inconvenient. I want to be the kind of person who keeps her promises even when it requires sacrifice. I want to be someone you can trust to put you first when you need me to. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. "Mom, let me finish. I know I can't undo what I did at the airport. I can't take back the months when I made you feel like you didn't matter to me. But I want to spend whatever time we have left before you leave for college proving that you do matter, that you've always mattered, and that I'm sorry it took almost losing you to remember how to be your mother. You didn't almost lose me, didn't I? Jamie, you were prepared to cut me out of your life entirely, rather than continue accepting the scraps of attention I was giving you, and you would have been right to do it. But I didn't do it, because you're a better person than I deserved. Because you were willing to fight for our relationship, even when I wasn't fighting for it myself." I wiped my eyes with the tissue Aunt Sarah handed me. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now I figure out how to be single again, and how to be your mother in the time we have left before you start your own adult life. And I hope you'll give me the chance to do better." "I've already given you that chance." "Mom, the past 6 months. The past 6 months have been me trying to balance being Richard's wife with being your mother. Now I get to focus on just being your mother. Are you sure that's what you want? You seemed really happy being married." "I was happy pretending to be someone Richard wanted me to be. But that person wasn't sustainable, and she wasn't someone I liked very much. I'd rather be alone and authentic than married and playing a role. It was the most self-aware thing I'd heard my mother say in over a year. "I'm proud of you," I said, surprising myself. "For what?" "For choosing yourself. For choosing honesty. For choosing our relationship over a marriage that required you to be someone else." "I'm proud of you too," she said, "for not letting me disappear into Richard's expectations. For demanding better from me even when it would have been easier to just accept whatever I was willing to give you." We talked for another hour about college plans, about her divorce proceedings, about the possibility of taking that Paris trip we'd never had. Just the two of us this time, when she was ready to travel again and I had a break from school. "I love you, Jamie," she said before we hung up. "And I'm going to spend every day proving that love means showing up, not just saying the words. I love you too, Mom." After I hung up, Aunt Sarah handed me a cup of tea and settled into her chair across from me. Good news? She asked. Good news. They're getting divorced. And Mom wants to focus on being my mother instead of trying to be Richard's perfect wife. How do you feel about that? Hopeful, I said. Cautiously hopeful. That's probably the right way to feel. Change takes time, and people don't transform overnight. I know. But I think she's finally figured out who she wants to be, and that person is someone I can have a relationship with. And if she backslides? If she meets someone else and starts the same pattern over again? Then I'll know I gave her every chance to be my mother, and I'll build my life around people who don't need me to compromise my worth to earn their attention. Aunt Sarah raised her teacup. To knowing your worth. To building a life with people who recognize it, I replied. 3 months later, I graduated from high school with Mom sitting in the front row, cheering louder than any other parent when they called my name. She'd kept her promise about showing up, not just physically but emotionally, consistently, in ways that mattered. We took the Paris trip that summer, just the two of us, visiting the museums and cafes and neighborhoods I'd dreamed about seeing. She told me stories about her college trip there 25 years earlier. And I told her about my plans for Harvard, for studying literature and maybe law, for building a life that was intentionally chosen rather than accidentally inherited. On our last night in Paris, as we sat at a sidewalk cafe watching people walk by in the golden evening light, Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Thank you, she said. For what? For not giving up on me when I gave up on myself. For demanding that I be better than I thought I was capable of being. For teaching me that love is a choice you make every day, not just a feeling you have. You taught me the same thing, I said, just not in the way you intended. I'm sorry it took so long for me to learn the lesson. I'm just glad you learned it at all. The next fall, I started at Harvard, where Aunt Sarah would continue to be the family member who showed up consistently, where I'd build new relationships with people who valued me, where I'd study and grow and become whoever I was meant to be. Mom visited twice that first semester, taking the train up from New York to have lunch and walk around campus and hear about my classes and my friends and my plans for the future. She asked questions that showed she was listening, remembered details from previous conversations, made it clear that my life mattered to her in ways that weren't dependent on what anyone else thought or wanted. It wasn't the family I'd started with, but it was the family we'd chosen to become. Honest about our flaws, committed to doing better, built on the understanding that love is something you demonstrate through actions, not just words. And sometimes the worst betrayal of your life, being abandoned by someone who should have protected you, becomes the catalyst for the most important lesson you'll ever learn. That you deserve to be chosen, consistently and intentionally, by the people who claim to love you. Mom had finally learned to choose me, and I'd learned to choose myself. It was the beginning of everything that mattered.